Welcome to Lesson 15 of Fundamentals of Programming. This is the lesson where we combine everything that we've learned and review it by writing some actual programs. These are programs that you might encounter during interviews. A lot of interviewers like to give entry-level programs to make sure that their interviewees know how to program. So these are going to be examples that you might find in the real world. We are going to plan these programs, write those programs, and then test them to make sure that they work. So the first program that we are going to write is called the FizzBuzz program. This is going to output the numbers from 1 to 100, but for multiples of 3, we output the word fizz. For multiples of 5, we output the word buzz. And then for numbers that are multiples of 3 and 5, we output the word fizzbuzz. So the output will look something like this. 1, 2, fizz, 4, buzz, fizz, 7, 8, fizz, buzz, and so on and so forth. 15 will be fizz buzz. Well, you know, going to 100 might be a little ridiculous, so let's change this and let's say 30. That's far more manageable. And let's plan just a little bit how we are going to do this. Well, first we need to count from 1 to 30. Well, the easiest way to do that is using a loop, and since we are counting, it would be very easy to use a for loop. So we will use a for loop to count. Next, we need to determine if the count is a multiple of 3 or 5. Well, we can use the modulo operator to do that. If you remember in the lesson where we talked about arrays, we used the index number, which I'm going to use the number 4 here, along with the modulo operator and the number 2 to determine if a number was even, because every even number can be divided by 2. So for mod 2 would tell us if a number is even, because that would give us the value of 0, because remember, the modulo operator returns the remainder of the division of the two numbers. But if we change this to 5, then we get a remainder that is not 0. So we would know that that is not an even number. Well, we can do the same thing to determine if a number is a factor of another number. So we can do 6 mod 3. That's going to give us a value of 0 because 3 goes into 6 evenly. But it does not go into 7 evenly, so we would know that the number 7 is not a number that we want to output fizz. Anytime that we got a modulo value of 0, we would know that we want to output fizz. The same thing with 5. If we have the modulo output of 0, then we know we want to output the word buzz. In the case of 6 mod 5, that's not the case because 5 does not go into 6 evenly. But if we have 10, which is a factor of 5, then we will get a mod value of 0, and so we would know to output the word buzz. Well, this is a pretty good place to stop planning and start coding. So I'm going to open up the code files for FizzBuzz. And let's first look at the HTML. There's nothing spectacular here. We just simply reference the FizzBuzz JavaScript file, so we can close that. And the JavaScript file is empty. So let's get started by writing the code to count from 1 to 30. That's very easy to do. We just use a for loop, and then we create our counter variable. If you remember from whenever we talked about loops and indexes, I said that I typically use II. I'm just going to use I because it's a little bit simpler here and I don't need to search for this particular variable. So I'm going to do var I equals 1 because we want to count from 1 to 30. So we'll start at 1 and we want to iterate for as long as I is less than or equal to 30. And then we want to increment our I variable. So I plus equals 1. That will increment it. And then inside of the loop, we want to determine if I is a factor of 3 or 5. And if it's not, then we want to display just the number. So let's first do if I mod 3 equals 0. And you can use the identity operator if you wanted to. I'm just going to use equality. 1, because I know that these are going to be numeric values, and 2, it's just a little bit easier to type in this particular scenario, so I'm just going to do the equality operator. If I is a factor of 3, then we want to output fizz. I'm just going to comment that for now. Else if I mod 5 equals 0, Then we want to output buzz. And finally, if all of those fail, then we want to simply output the number. So we will comment number. Now we need to determine how we want to write these values. We can use an alert function, but we would have to click the OK button 30 times, and I don't want to do that. We can also use the console, which we have done before. That's just a little bit small and a lot of scrolling, so that in order for you to see the output, it's just kind of cumbersome. So instead, we are going to write things into the browser itself, into the document. The browser gives us an object called document, which allows us to interface with the document that is loaded in the browser. The document object has a method called write, which allows us to write information directly into the document. So in the case of the code that we have inside of else, we will use the document write method, and then we will write the number that is currently being counted. So we will simply do I. And then we will replicate this code for the buzz, and we will replace I with a string of buzz. And then for fizz, we will simply output fizz. But this is going to give us a slight little formatting issue, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's run this in the browser, and you'll see that everything is all on one line, which makes this very difficult to read. The reason being because document.write lets us write HTML into the document. So since we have written information without any formatting, then the browser is rendering it all as inline text. So we need to append just something very simple, but a BR element to every time that we use the write method. That's going to add a new line so that everything is on its own separate line. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we can see that everything now is nice and neat. We can read these. And if we look at the output, we are almost to our desired goal. The only thing is the 15 and the 30. We are supposed to have fizzbuzz at 15 and fizzbuzz at 30. So we need to go back to our code and make sure that we write the code to do that. Well, the reason why we're getting this just fizz instead of fizzbuzz is because of how we have our code set up. We are first testing to see if I is a factor of 3, and if that's the case, then we are outputting fizz. Well, 15 is a factor of 3. So this condition returns true, we write fizz, and then nothing else is done because it doesn't need to check anything else for the else if or the else. So we need to make the check for fizzbuzz the first check that we do. So we need to check for both if I mod 3 equals 0 and I mod 5 equals 0. So we need to do I mod 3 equals 0 and I mod 5 equals 0. And then if that's the case, then we will simply output fizzbuzz. We need an else before that if. We'll make that nice and pretty. So we will document.write fizzbuzz. And then we also need the breaking element there. And we will go back and see if our output is how we want it. And there we go, it is. 15 and 30 are now fizzbuzz, and then every factor of 3 is fizz, every factor of 5 is buzz. So we have just solved the fizzbuzz problem. But we can make this a little bit cleaner because if you notice, we have some repetition in our code. We have a lot of document writes, and then we are writing a particular value plus the BR element. So we can simplify this so that we store fizzbuzz and fizz and buzz and the number in a variable and then only use the document write once after all of the if and else if and else if. So let's first create a variable. We'll call this output, and we will start it off with a value of I. So it has a default value of whatever number is the count. And this will actually allow us to simplify our code a little bit more because we no longer need this else statement, but we're going to leave it there so that I can show you what exactly it is that I mean. So for each of these, we will simply just do output equals fizzbuzz. and we'll get rid of each call to document write. So next we will want to set output to fizz. So let's paste in that. Let's get rid of buzz. We'll do the same thing for buzz. And this is what I'm talking about in the else. We are saying output equals I, but we've already started off with output equals I. So we can actually get rid of this else. And then after we are done making all of our decisions, we can do document.write output plus the BR element. So we've made our code a little bit more simpler, a lot easier to read, at least in my opinion, and we haven't changed the output whatsoever. See, everything is just as it was before, and I did save that so that I didn't repeat the most common mistake that I make. So there we go. That is our FizzBuzz application. This works exactly as we wanted it to, and if we want to modify it to count up to 100, all we really have to do is change our condition to specify 100. So let's go back to the browser, let's refresh, and we can see that we have a lot more output that we can go through. We aren't going to do that because we need to move on to our second problem, which is our times tables. We want our program to output the multiplication tables for 1 through 5 up to 10. Now that's kind of clear as mud, so let's look at it at an example. We want to start off with 1 times 1, and then do 1 times 2, 1 times 3, 1 times 4, all the way to 1 times 10, and then we want to start with 2. So we'll do 2 times 1, 2 times 2, 2 times 3, all the way to 2 times 10. And then we will keep doing that all the way to 5 times 10. So we know that we want to count from 1 to 5, and we've already established that counting is very easy to do with a for loop. So we will use a for loop to count from 1 to 5. Well, we also want to count from 1 to 10 because we need to do that multiplication. So we can use another for loop to count from 1 to 10. Now, whenever we talked about loops, I didn't say this, but we can do what's called nesting a loop inside of a loop. That's just basically writing a for loop inside of another for loop. So let's go ahead and write this so that we can see what this code looks like, and then we can go from there. So let's open up the files that I have for times tables. We'll look at the HTML file. There's nothing special here. We are just referencing that JavaScript file. So inside of timetables.js, let's write our first for loop. So this is going to be the one that counts from 1 to 5. So we will have our counter variable. We'll start at 1. And as long as I is less than or greater to 5, then this little loop will iterate. And then we want to increment our counter by I plus equals 1. Let's finish that off with our curly braces. And then inside of the for loop, we want to count again from 1 to 10. So we will use another for loop. Our counter variable will be j. We do not want to use I because that's going to mess up our outer for loop. So you will typically see people use j inside of another for loop that is nested. So we will do var j equals or 1. We'll do j is less than or equal to 10, and then j will be incremented by 1. Okay, so before we do anything, let's go over what happens here. We start with this outer loop. I is equal to 1, and this loop is going to iterate. Well, for each iteration, it's going to execute another for loop. So when I is 1, j is going to be 1, and then this inner for loop is going to iterate. J is going to be 2. The inner loop will iterate again. J will be 3, and then j will be 4, and j will be 5, all the way up to 10. And then whenever this inner loop is done iterating, then this outer loop will iterate, and then I will be 2. And then we'll start all over again with this inner loop. So it will start off with 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and so on and so forth until j is 10. And then when that's done iterating, the outer loop will iterate once again. I will be 3. And then we'll start the inner loop once again. J will be 1 all the way to 10. So this is how we are going to do our multiplication table. So inside of this inner loop is where the majority of the rest of our code is going to be. Now, we are going to write a function that is going to multiply the two values together. Our two values are I and j. I is going to be 1 through 5, j is going to be 1 through 10. So let's write a function that's going to multiply those values together. Function, we'll call this product x and y. You can use whatever parameter names that you want. And we simply want to return x times y. And we will use this function inside of this second for loop. And we will also use the document write method. We will specify that we are going to multiply I and j together, and then we will perform the actual multiplication. So we will do I, and then we will concatenate a string that contains the asterisk to denote that we are multiplying I and j together. Then we also need to concatenate a string that contains the equal sign. Then we want to concatenate the call to the product function. So we will pass I and j. And then we also want to concatenate the BR element so that everything will be on its own line. So if we run this in the browser, we should get exactly what we want. So let's do so. We'll go to times tables and run that. And we can see that we are getting 1 times 1 equals 1, 1 times 2 equals 2, with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 10. And then we start with 2's. So 2 times 1 is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So far, everything looks like we got exactly what we wanted. And it is. One thing that might help, though, is if we separate the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4s with multiple line breaks so that there is a visual break between the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's go back, and we need to add another document write call and specify a BR element to write to the document. But where do we do that? Well, the only place to do that is after this inner for loop executes, because this is where our times table is being written. After this inner for loop is done iterating, then we're done outputting the times table for whatever I is. So if we add a line break here, document.write, and then add the BR element, then that is going to add an extra line break after the times table for I. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we will see a visual break between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. So we wrote two little applications. They were basically meaningless applications, but they were good practice nonetheless. We knew what the problems were. We kind of planned, we wrote code, then we massaged code until we got the output that we wanted. This is the last lesson in this course where we write any code. There's just one more lesson left, but it's more of a conclusion where we summarize everything that we've learned, and hopefully I get to point you into whatever direction that you want to go as far as learning the language that you want to learn.